Jim Powell, a middle-aged man, narrates the first episode of the series. He works as a police artist and is somewhat dissatisfied with both his family and profession. His scientist wife, Stephanie, works really hard for a large scientific company called Global Tech, as she's currently doing research on a mysterious plant. Daphne and JJ, his two teenage children, are constantly on their phones and don't have time for activities like playing catch with their father. They're losing the ties that a typical family should have among themselves. Fed up, Jim makes the decision that they will all accompany Mom on her research trip to Brazil so they can all spend some family time together. Jim proposes that they take a flight over the Amazon rainforest while they're traveling, but things don't go according to plan. Due to an approaching storm, the plane is forced to land in the ocean, which is somewhat shining with tiny neon particles. Fortunately, Jim's family is unharmed, but their pilot is not so lucky. In the next scene, Jim and his family are all back home, leading their separate lives again. After returning from the trip, Jim is back at work at the precinct, where he talks with a female detective, Detective Cho, about a case. As they're talking, a guy in the station suddenly grabs an officer's gun and points it at the detective. Jim sees this and dives to push her out of the way, saving her. However, the gun still goes off. After a while, Detective Cho gets up and wonders where the bullet is. Jim then excuses himself and looks in his hand. There's the bullet. Apparently, he caught the bullet with his own hand without getting hurt. Jim is shocked to comprehend what just happened. He then goes to a batting cage to explore what might have just happened to him. He tips off the security guy and manages to have the whole place for him for an hour. Setting the pitching machine to 90 miles per hour, he surprisingly catches pitches without a problem. Then he increases the speed to 140 miles per hour. Still no problem. Just then, his best friend and colleague George, who is a district attorney, shows up and Jim gives him a gun. George isn't keen on shooting Jim, but he accidentally fires the gun and Jim catches the bullet again. Both of them are left in utter disbelief by what just happened. In the meantime, Stephanie is in a dilemma. She wants to have a nice dinner with Jim, but work is demanding her attention. She has to get across town for a work meeting, but the traffic is very bad. Having no other option, she starts running, and this is when she goes faster and faster. She zooms past cars on the freeway and manages to get to the office on time. It seems like Stephanie has also gotten some new abilities. Back at the lab, she tells her lab tech, Katie, about it, and they go to a racehorsing track to test her abilities. While Stephanie starts to run on the track, Katie, with a radar gun, reads that Stephanie's speed is in the whopping 700 mile per hour range. With her newfound ability, Stephanie scoots back home to help her son JJ with homework, as he has a learning disability. In the meantime, Jim and George arrive at a rooftop. George is convinced that Jim has another superpower as well, that he can fly. Jim is skeptical, but gives in and jumps off the rooftop. Unfortunately, his hunch turns out to be true, and he drops to the ground, making a massive crater in it. When he gets up, he looks at the top of the building and leaps back to the roof. This makes Jim realize that although he cannot fly, he can leap like a crazy superhero. As the two men return to their car, their police scanner crackles. It turns out that a guy who's been robbing jewelry stores is being pursued downtown. Jim starts to leap in that direction. He ends up catching the guy in an alley, but before he can subdue him, the bad guy's partner suddenly shoots him in the back of the head. Jim pulls the bullet out of his head, but he is bleeding. Before falling unconscious, he calls George for help. The following morning, Jim wakes up in bed to find George and Stephanie in front of him. Stephanie asks him what the matter is, and Jim finally tells her what's going on. Shocked, she also tells her husband that she's acquired superhuman powers. Meanwhile, their daughter Daphne is having boyfriend trouble at school. The class flirt, Sarah, is hitting on him. Worried, she talks to her friend Lindsay about it. Later, as Daphne plays in her basketball game, she starts to hear everyone's thoughts. It freaks her out, so she calls her parents to pick her up from school. Daphne then tells her mom about her being able to read people's minds. This makes Stephanie realize that even her daughter has gained some kind of ability. Cut to the next scene. The Powells call for a family meeting. They learn that everyone has some kind of power, except for poor JJ. The next day, however, while JJ is taking a math test, things start to glow on the board and the answers for the test appear right in front of him. He smiles and quickly writes everything down. Elsewhere, Daphne meets her boyfriend, and as they kiss, she can read his thoughts. She sadly learns that he's sleeping with her best friend, Lindsay. She rushes out, leaving him unsure how she knew that he was cheating on her. At work, Jim draws a picture of the jewel thief based on the fight with him in the alley. He then runs the picture through facial recognition and manages to get an ID. Based on his information, Detective Cho and her associate prepare to track down the thief. Before they leave the precinct, they tell Jim to stay behind since he's just an artist and not a crime fighter. When the detectives show up at the thief's apartment, a shootout ensues, and Detective Cho ends up in the trunk of his car. Just when the thief is about to drive off, Jim arrives there. They start to fight, but this time, the jewel thief is ready for him. Jim strikes at him, but the thief surprisingly vanishes and reappears in the back. The thief then tells Jim that he's not the only one who's got superpowers. They continue fighting, with Jim never being able to land a clean punch on the bad guy. This is until the thief ends up behind Jim with a gun pointed at his neck. Suddenly, a shot rings out. Thankfully, it's from Detective Cho. It turns out that she managed to get out of the trunk and shoot the bad guy. It's revealed that she didn't see Jim's superpower, so she tells him to leave before Internal Affairs starts asking questions. Afterward, the scene shifts to a morgue, where a mysterious man, who surprisingly turns out to be Stephanie's boss from Global Tech, tells his associate Morgan that they should kill the person behind the thief's death. The following day, Jim continues to try to fight crime by leaping to a bank robbery. He ends up in an alley with the robbers driving a van straight for him. He then decides to stop the van, but gets run over instead. In the meantime, Stephanie and her lab assistant Katie work on getting a water sample from the Amazon River, where the plane crash happened. Stephanie thinks that the water has something to do with her and her family's superpower. Once back at home, Stephanie starts doing house chores on super speed. She then believes she has time for everything. Meanwhile, her son JJ starts doing better on his tests because, just like his family, he now has a super brain power. One day in the library, Daphne hears her brother learning complex trigonometry theories. She is surprised to see him there, as he was never into studies. JJ finally opens up to tell her about his power. But he does confess that he hasn't told their parents because they were so proud of him after he did well on the tests. Feeling bad, Daphne says she'll keep his secret. Later, after the bell rings, JJ's teacher accuses him of cheating on the last few tests because the kid always failed on his math tests. But now he's getting straight A's. In response, JJ blows him away with some complex math talk. But his teacher still wants to talk to his parents about his cheating. Afterward, Jim talks to JJ about the tests. Sadly, JJ gets the impression that his dad thinks he's cheating too and storms off. The following day, Morgan, the man from the morgue, who was friends with the now-dead thief, comes into the police station and talks to Detective Cho. He asks her if she noticed anything weird or unusual about the bank robber she shot last week. The detective notices something is off with the guy, so she says she didn't notice anything weird. In the meantime, George is doing some police work with the sketch that Jim had drawn of the bank robbers. He then goes to a bank he believes the thief will target next. While George is showing the sketch to some guards, the bank robbers show up with their guns. George hides away and calls Jim. Although he manages to let his friend know about the robbery, he is caught by the robbers and shoved into their van. Thankfully, Jim arrives at the scene in the nick of time. Initially, he gets run over, but then regains his composure, grabs the van, and throws it over. Jim then helps George out of the van just as Detective Cho shows up to pursue the robbers. She is still clueless about his power. Cut to the next scene. Stephanie and Katie study the water they managed to retrieve from the Amazon. Much to their surprise, they realize there's nothing special about it, leading them to wonder what could actually be the source of their powers. Meanwhile, Detective Cho comes home to her apartment, and Morgan is there waiting for her. It turns out he has telekinesis and uses it to choke her. He asks her who else knows that the bank robber she shot last week had powers. Cho says she doesn't know anything about it. Morgan lets her fall to the floor, but forces her to point her own gun towards her. Cho starts to freak out, and as Morgan gets out of the apartment, a gunshot is heard, supposedly killing the detective. He then calls Stephanie's boss at Global Tech, telling him that everything is taken care of. Cut to the next scene. The Powells attend a friend's wedding. However, a bunch of robbers crash the wedding, asking everyone to put their jewelry in a box. The thieves also take Stephanie's wedding ring. But the Powells decide not to use their superpower to get back at the robbers, realizing that they would be risking their lives. The next day, Stephanie manages to get the funding for her research at Global Tech. But her boss tells her that as part of the funding, they need to test her blood sample for insurance purposes. The company already has her sample as it was taken some time ago for a similar project. Realizing that her boss and the others would find out about her superpower once the blood is tested, Stephanie comes up with a plan to switch her blood sample with Katie's. In the next scene, Daphne and her dad Jim talk about how things are going. Just then, he gets a call from George about another wedding that is likely to be robbed. Therefore, Jim lies to her that he has some emergency work at the precinct. However, since Daphne can read minds, she learns about his lies. That night, Stephanie and Katie are at Global Tech to switch some of Stephanie's blood samples. Katie has the route mapped. Stephanie just has to break in without slowing down, or the cameras will see her. Additionally, she has to swipe a key card at one point. She manages to do that and get past the guards without being noticed. She then successfully swipes the blood samples. In the meantime, George and Jim are at the wedding. Just then, the robbers show up and Jim tries to subdue them. During this time, he gets shot, but the bullets don't work on him. The robbers believe Jim to be a cop wearing a bulletproof vest, so they try to escape, but not before he punches one of them unconscious. The robbers and Jim all rush out past Daphne, who is at the venue to see what her dad was up to. Apparently, her dad is trying to fight criminals all by himself. When Jim sees that the robbers are getting away through a rope, he leaps up on a building and manages to grab one of them by the leg. The robber falls down onto an arriving cop car, but surprisingly survives. When Jim returns home, Stephanie and Daphne are waiting for him, angry about his lying. Apparently, they had promised each other that they will not be using their power until they really know what's happening to them. Jim tells them that his powers are finally letting him be the person he wants to be. The following day at work, George tells Jim that they had to let go of the robber Jim caught yesterday, since they have no evidence. However, George does not have Stephanie's ring, which was recovered at the scene. In the meantime, Global Tech's boss calls in an employee, asking if he was in the building the other day, as his card was used to access the lab. We realize that the card was stolen by Stephanie to break in, but the employee is clueless about this. Later, the boss observes the CCTV footage, but doesn't see anyone. However, he does notice Stephanie's blood vials swiftly disappearing and appearing in the lab's refrigerator. Now the boss is suspicious of Stephanie. That night, Jim takes Stephanie to dinner on the roof of a restaurant. They dance together, and he once again proposes to her with her recovered engagement ring.